Let's bring in our panel for the Weekly Standard. Kirsten Powers, columnist for the Daily Beast, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Let's start with the news conference today, a statement, and then taking questions from the press. Charles.
Well, he was, even for the president, unusually arrogant and dismissive of the Republicans, implying that he stands for peace and truth and justice, fairness, and the Republicans care only about partisanship. But when he was asked, what would you, he says, I'm not a dictator, I'm the president. He's acting like he's a bystander. He said, he asked the president, what should I have done? Well, I'll give him a couple of suggestions. When the House passed a bill that would have shifted the cuts from discretionary spending, which is a lot harder to do, onto entitlements, which is where the money is, he said he would veto it. And therefore, he would, which had he done that, the Senate never accepted it, so he didn't have to. But had he done that, it would have brought on the sequester, which he now says is going to have all these horrible effects. And secondly, what he could have done is when the Senate Republicans offered him in a bill just yesterday authority over moving the funds, so you can take it out of a low priority program or one that's not working and spare the important ones like meat inspection and air traffic control. He refused it, and he said had it passed, he would have issued a veto. He wants to let all of this happen in order that it causes maximum disruption and pain, in order that the Republicans will come on their knees to him in a couple of months and cave on loopholes on taxes and on spending.
Kirsten, he said just a couple weeks ago that he was not interested in playing a blame game. He did do that today pretty specifically. He also, while saying that it was not going to be felt right away, a couple of times, a couple of different ways, he also said this in just a couple of minutes later.
Starting tomorrow, everybody here, all the folks who are cleaning the floors at the Capitol, now that Congress has left, somebody's going to be vacuuming and cleaning those floors and throwing out the garbage. They're going to have less pay. The janitors, the security guards, they just got a pay cut. And they got to figure out how to manage that. That's real.
Well, the architect of the Capitol says that's not real. Quote, we do not anticipate furloughs for AOC employees as a result of sequestration. That means any of the janitors will not see any pay cuts. Now, when it comes to overtime, they may cut back on overtime. But as far as pay cuts, that's not going to happen. The Washington Post says this, quote, Obama's remarks continue the administration's pattern of overstating the potential impact of the sequester, which we have explored this week. I guess, you know, and we've explored it, obviously, on this panel. Yeah. Thoughts?
Well, I don't know why they insist on exaggerating when the cuts actually there will be people who lose their jobs.
Sure.
You know, so why do you
clear.
have to make
We talked about that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think that they could have an impact on the economy actually, and there are people who will lose their jobs. For example, you know, people who defense contractors. They're gonna lose jobs from maybe building a ship or something, but we also have actual government employees who will be losing jobs. So why they insist on doing this, I don't know. In terms of the blame game, both sides are to blame. So for the president to try to pretend like this is something that sort of organically happened and he had nothing to do with it is completely silly. The other thing is, how are we having this conversation about deficit reduction without ever talking about entitlements? And he said in the press conference today, I'm now willing to take on my party on entitlements, which is complete lip service, because what has he been doing for the last 4 years? And it seems like a sort of setup where he'll maybe go to a couple of Democrats, say, hey, I think we should cut entitlements, and they'll say no, and then he'll say, oh, okay. You know, but where's the serious plan? Where's the barnstorming? Where's the going out to the people to raise awareness and support and grassroots support for cutting entitlements? Nowhere.
Steve.
No, the only reason, I mean, to go back to the original question, what could the president have done? The only reason we're having these discussions is because the president has been totally AWOL on the question of debt and deficits. It's clearly not a priority for this president to reduce the deficit, to reduce the size of the national debt. He's made that clear, I think, in the way that he's governed. He's made that clear in the budget proposals that he's offered, particularly after the 2010 midterm elections, which were focused on spending and the size and scope of government. It's not a priority for the president. So had he made it a priority, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having these kinds of discussions. I'm glad that we are. If you look at what the president is likely to do now, I don't think he has any idea. This is one of the worst weeks the president has had in a couple of years, I would say. You've got a mainstream media that has seemingly turned on him, maybe temporarily, but has been very critical of all of these exaggerations, saying things that plainly are not true. The question is, will they continue this kind of scrutiny as we go through the upcoming budget fights that Carl Cameron laid out? And what's interesting about that prospect is the last time the president had a terrible week was back in February of 2011, after he introduced a budget that did nothing at all on debt, on deficit, on entitlements.
Next up is the continuing resolution, which funds the government. It's March 27th is the deadline. Charles, you were going to say?
He will sign it, and he'll wait for the cuts to actually cause pain and disruption. He's playing a long game here. He gave in his inaugural address a vision of an entitlement state liberalism that is his legacy, but that's what he wants to enact. That there is one obstacle, the Republican House, that stopped him in the second half of the first term. He wants to destroy it. He beat them on the fiscal cliff, on taxes, and now he wants a way to destroy them on spending by waiting until the Republicans will cave on this and say, okay, we're going to give it to you in taxes instead of in cuts, because the pain will become intolerable. This is all about a political game, winning the upper hand for the rest of his agenda, because he isn't interested in spending or deficits or cuts at all.
I mentioned the CR. It's the next thing. The president signaled today, Kirsten, that if we stick to the deal, the Budget Control Act, I'll be supportive and stick to that deal. It's a deal I'll make, and I'll sign that, suggesting that he's in the negotiations right now and that they're trying to avoid this big standoff to March 27th. There's some signals that perhaps they're going to absorb some of this sequester pain in an inflated continuing resolution. We're going to mark all of this up next week and make sure everybody can understand it, and it requires a lot of blackboards and whiteboards and numbers, but we'll get down into the weeds and show everybody. But you know, we're into a lot of moving parts here.
Well, I think the expectation is that there'll be some sort of flexibility built into the continuing resolution. At least the House will probably pass something that includes something for the Defense Department. So they have to. The problem with this isn't that even if you agree that we need these cuts, they're reckless. The cuts are not targeted in any way, and you need to give the departments more flexibility in how they make the cuts. So probably that will go through the House, and then the Senate will say no, we have to include all the other agencies, and then I expect the president will sign it.
Okay, next up, the Friday lightning round.